It was a major script being flipped when being a leader for little Steph, that made sense. But being a leader in the church, that opened up this whole new thing that I really had not realized.
Welcome to Flip Your Script, the podcast about life's critical turning points and how people find the inspiration and motivation to move forward and rewrite their unique stories. Flip Your Script is produced by Media Minefield, a public relations firm passionate about the power of sharing stories. Specializing in earned and social media, Media Minefield helps clients take control of their unique story and message. The show is hosted by Kristi Piehl, founder and CEO of Media Minefield, who flipped her script from an Emmy-winning journalist to a successful entrepreneur and speaker.
Many of our stereotypes are born from our families and childhoods. Our normal is defined and shaped by what we see and experience. Today's guest took her upbringing and the strict role and gender definitions associated with it and flipped the script. Stephanie Williams O'Brien is an author, podcaster, pastor working on her real estate empire, and she has the coolest tattoos I have ever seen. Pastor Steph, welcome to the Flip Your Script podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here. I think the tattoos are really cool too. I'll just be honest.
They're super cool. We have to talk about the tattoos at some point during the podcast, and then we have to get people to your Instagram to look at them because they're so cool. So I did the whole intro. You do all these things, and I feel like when people think pastor, they have a really specific, often sort of negative and stuffy understanding of what that is, and you're none of those things.
Thank you.
But I think some people listening to this would go, gender, that's really a thing that like women can't do. And then some people say, oh my gosh, she's a pastor, I'm turning this off. So
bye.
Yeah.
Bye, people.
Have a good day. So for some folks, this is a very controversial topic. And for some folks, it's like, seriously, we're still talking about this. But for you and your family and your personal story is where I want to talk about, because that's so interesting. What you grew up and where you grew up and how you saw what a pastor means, and then where you are now. Talk about you as a little girl. You as a little girl growing up, going to church. What does pastor mean?
Yeah, totally. And I'll definitely say, hey, look, it's fine if there's some different opinions on it. I've got tough skin and a soft heart. That's what I always say. So we can agree to disagree on that. So, if you are feeling like you're going to turn it off, you can stay. We can talk. It's going to be fun. So little Steph was, stepping into the world, not having any idea what leadership means, but living it since I was maybe 3. I didn't know anything different. Actually was one of the only kids around at the time when I was little, because my parents were working for the evangelist Billy Graham. And so, the Graham family comes from a more conservative aspect of Christianity, yet the focus was on evangelism. And so topics of theology around gender and other things often weren't really the focus in that space. So honestly, I had never really heard people discuss women not being pastors. I just had never seen one. And when you're a little girl, you just don't, it's kind of like you can't be what you can't see, right? That quote that has been so common. So I think I didn't see women leading in a lot of spaces. And then when I did see women lead in certain spaces, that just made sense to me. And it never seemed odd to me that women would lead. And my mom's a strong woman, strong leader. My dad always told me, like most millennial children were told, you can be whatever you want to be when you grow up. Yet my dad was an ordained Southern Baptist pastor in a denomination that still does not affirm women leading in any space, pretty much, except with children under 12, if I'm correct. And so I think my parents were in an evolutionary time in their understanding too. And there were some scripts being flipped for my parents as well. And they were from the South, from Louisiana, and had begun working with the Graham ministry. So when I was a little girl, we were living in Europe and all these different places in different parts of the world until I was maybe 5 or 6, and we moved to Minnesota. And so I was in this family that had this like Southern situation and this like Southern Baptist situation. Yet we were living all over the world with people that were more diverse than you can imagine. I had these aunties and uncles that were all different backgrounds and different races. And I loved it. I was just thrilled. And I look back and I think, what an honor to have these folks in my life. And I saw women leading. My dad had hired women that were leading in different ways. And one of his highest directors was a woman who was from India. And So she was single. So, those boxes weren't there, yet I was living in a society and a part of the society that the boxes very much were there, if that makes sense. And it just wasn't as explicit as now when I look back, I think, oh, wait a second, it was there. And that's why I never would have pictured myself doing what I'm doing now, because I literally did not see it. I did not see a woman preaching, I mean, maybe on TV or something, but not live until I was in college at Bethel. And so it was a major script being flipped when being a leader for little Steph, that made sense. But being a leader in the church, that opened up this whole new thing that I really had not realized what I was opening up, I guess. And I'll just say, like, as I began to kind of grow into a teenager and begin to feel a call of ministry in my late teens, early college time, I didn't think, okay, what can I do that is all the on the nose, hot button things that makes everyone upset? I just felt called to leading. And then I felt called to the church. And then I'm just the kind of person that's going to do better, like executing a team than being executed. And then I love preaching. I love communicating. And these just happen to be the things that are debated, right? Women in lead roles over other people, not having male leadership over them, which I don't, except for my board that has men on it, having preaching, speaking from pulpits. These are the things that now I understand fully are the debate. But frankly, just what I felt called to and what I felt good at, and still feel like every day I wake up, this is what I'm made to do. And that's the same message my parents told me, right? Like, grow up and do what you feel like God was calling you to do. And so I've done that.
And at some point you had to tell family members that this is what I'm going to do and this is where I feel like I'm supposed to spend my career.
Yeah.
What was their reaction?
Yeah, it was interesting. So the interesting part of the story of my sense of kind of feeling like I wanted to go into ministry was that it happened like about 2 years or a year and a half after my dad had died. And so having this person in my life who, I mean, my dad is to this day one of my heroes and was so empowering of me as a young woman. I can't say enough about that. Wasn't a perfect dad by any means, but really empowered me. But I never had this conversation explicitly with him. I never talked with him about whether he thought women could lead in a church setting, or, we just never explicitly had the conversation. And he had always been so empowering of me, generally speaking. And so then when I came to this and realized this was a discussion, yeah, I had some anxiety and some fear about, well, I don't even know what my dad would say, and he's not here. And so I began figuring out kind of how do I tell my family, but also some of my friends. I realized that some of my friends in college had come from vastly different backgrounds, like that same description you just gave of, wait, gender's still a problem, to, whoa, this is not okay. I mean, my friends came from all those different backgrounds and we're all becoming young adults. And then my family back in Louisiana, where my grandpa was a pastor and my family had a long line of being pastors in different ways, but none of them had been women, of course. However, many of the women had been leading in churches without titles. So there was varied response. One of my two grandmas, I told her, and she said, "Oh, honey, women can't be ministers." I said, "Well, Nana, I'm going to do it anyway." And so then, I kid you not, the next time I talked to her, 2 weeks later, she said, "Oh, honey, I told my minister that my granddaughter's going to be a minister." And I said, "Well, Nana, you just said that you didn't think that was okay." And she said, "Well, that was before I had one of my own." Just hilarious.
Well, and how many times does that happen, whether it relates to sexual preference or orientation, where it's really easy to say, these people over here, they can't or they shouldn't. And then now I have one of my own. Now what am
Yeah,
I
I love
supposed to
this
do with
person.
that?
I love this person. I care about them. I want them to be who they are created to be. These are different questions than those people or that issue or this debate. Absolutely. So that was my grandma's response from my mom's side of the family. She was in Texas at the time. And I don't know what her minister said to her, but and then, my dad's side of the family, their response was maybe, I think it's difficult when someone gives you a negative response, but what else is difficult is when they don't respond. And that was kind of their way of doing it. They just kind of like, oh, and not really anything. And it was very clear, knowing kind of their experience, where they were coming from. Some of my my dad's side of the family, my uncles and aunts had stopped following me on Instagram and Facebook and different things early in the days of Facebook, I guess, in part because of my perspectives on a number of things, including that one of my cousins, there's a lot of cousins on my dad's side of the family. There was 5 kids in my dad's family. And one of my cousins is a worship pastor. And he's basically, his job is to make sure there's great music selected for a large megachurch on the West Coast. He doesn't do, from my understanding, he doesn't counsel people. He doesn't preach, he doesn't teach. And so he is seen as the person who's like taken on the family line where of pastors, where I like started an actual church and lead and teach and preach and have associate pastors and, empower a worship pastor. And, I think I feel really grateful because I think I've been given the opportunity to move through this situation without developing bitterness, because I've had so many people that have supported me and cheered me on, including my mom, who I think also didn't have this conversation with my dad because I just don't think they thought, I don't know, they just never talked about it. But my mom has been completely supportive from the beginning, my number one fan. I'm always like, Mom, you need to like tone it down how you're talking about me. I said to her once, I said, when you talk about me, it seems like you think I can walk on water or something. And she says, well, have you tried? So that's where my mom's at. So that's the most important thing to me, that my mom and then my younger brother, those are my 2, immediate family members. Him and his wife and kids go to my church, and then met my husband a few years ago, and he's a pastor's kid, and his dad is egalitarian or supports women in ministry in all roles, and his family, and so does my husband, of course. And so having those people in your life, whenever you're flipping your script in any way, if the closest people to you are willing to be there for you, I think that's a game changer. I think it would be a completely different conversation if those close people had not been in my corner on this. And my friends too. I came to my friends in college. I remember feeling nervous, and we got together. We kind of had like a house church thing going on before we even knew what house church was in college. And I came to them and I told them one week, all right, everybody, I've got something to share. I think I'm going to be a pastor. And they looked at me like, with the facial expression could best be described as, duh. Like they were like, what? And someone said, what do you think you've been doing with us these last 2 years of college? And I just thought, oh. And then we moved on. And interestingly enough, that was the most affirming thing, that it was like a non-issue to them. Like, of course, that's so obvious. We thought you had already told us that. You didn't know, you haven't said that out loud yet? Oh, weird. Okay. Anyway, go around the circle and someone else shared whatever's going on in their life. And in a lot of ways, I think that's been my experience, is that I think it's been just the right next step for me, and every step along the way. And I don't need there to be a little parade or a fireworks display to say that I've found this calling of mine. It's just felt natural and normal, and been affirmed in the most healthy, normal ways by the people that matter the most. But there's been challenges along the way from the external perspective, but mostly not by people that were related to me. So that's been good.
A couple of things about your story. Take away the controversial Christian piece of this, because some people that they can't relate to that, and it doesn't, they're still like, what are you, I don't even understand why we're talking
what
about.
Even is this?
Right.
You Christians, you're so unusual.
Right. So if we take that part out of it and we go to the point of someone who's saying, I want to do something that I didn't know, that I've never seen that around me. The people around me may or may not approve of it. And I love, first of all, that you said to Nana, well, Nana, I'm going to do it anyway, which is really important, because you could have said, oh gosh, you're right. And the negative voices could have said, oh, I shouldn't do that. I can't do that. I probably, you're right. So you said, well, Nana, I'm going to do it anyway. Mm-hmm. Number one. And you talked about the other family members who said nothing. Mm-hmm. And no comment is a comment.
Yeah, it is.
In all aspects. So they don't have to, again, to your point, they don't have to throw a parade, but even to say, good for you, I'm cheering for you,
is telling me, I don't know.
Right. Something people in relationship owe that much to each other, because you trusted them with a piece of information that potentially was hard to share. And as it turns out, was pretty controversial for them. Yeah. So how do you think your path, being now pretty loud voice in this space when it comes to not the controversial part of it, but just ministry and how ministry will look in the future, and the kind of people that you're leading, which are not your suburban, grew up in church, been to church forever, but you're really reaching a different kind of population. And I don't mean different in like unique. I mean different in maybe people that haven't ever been to a church before. And you have this whole different calling that wasn't the kind of calling that your grandpa had.
Yeah.
And now little girls can see you doing that. Do you feel an
Yeah.
extra pressure that people are watching?
Well, that's a good question. I think that the gender thing, first of all, it's in an interesting way. It's only part of it. I mean, earlier you were talking about the perception of people being stuffy, like pastors being stuffy. And the truth is that I hadn't seen a female pastor until I was in college. I also hadn't seen someone with my personality. I am an entrepreneurial person. I like to start things. I like to do things. I'm a go-getter. I love to pursue excellence and just see how we can do more together. I'm just one of those people that turns out is great for leading a church in certain ways, and certain types of people, like you said, and that there isn't just one type of personality. So there was I was overcoming that as well. And so my personality being more unique in that space, at least compared to some people, and then my gender. I was single for a really long time as well when we were starting the church. So there was that. I think it's Shonda Rhimes that talks about the FOD, or the first, only, and different. And being an FOD in any space puts a pressure on you that you're not necessarily ready for or didn't ask for, that's for sure. And so for her as a show writer, of such popular shows like Grey's Anatomy and other things, like she is like the first, only, and different as a single Black woman everywhere she is in a lot of ways. And so while I can't identify that from a racial perspective, I do feel like there is this extra, it's just like always there. Like, it's just kind of always there. It's this constant, like, okay, is gender a part of this conversation? As I've talked with my therapist about kind of how to hold that in a healthy way, we've distinguished the difference between being aware and being vigilant. And that vigilance is, and maybe it's just semantics, but vigilance is like that really hyper awareness, and that's not very sustainable. And that's the thing that I think leads to assuming something's about gender, maybe when it's not, or not giving people the benefit of the doubt anymore. And so for me, I've tried to stay in that space of awareness, and that looks like being ready when I'm on a couple boards where I'm one of the only women, and somebody asked me to take notes once. Only women. And I was aware enough to go, oh, no, how about Mark? Like, and actually the gentleman who asked me, I saw him realize the mistake in the moment. Like, oh, wow. Like his implicit bias asked me to take notes because of my gender. I'm actually terrible at that. So it's not only that I shouldn't do it because of being the only woman in the room, but I'm also not going to take very good notes, sir. So that's the way it is. So it's a kind of the awareness piece, but I do feel that pressure sometimes. Another dynamic in the church world that people who are maybe outside of it, just to let you know about how just really strange we are, there's also this other dynamic having to do with your spouse and what they do or don't do. And so for male pastors, there's often an assumption that their wife is going to like almost essentially work for the church for free and be like the volunteer extraordinaire and lead ministries without getting paid. And that's changing in churches, but that's been a historical problem. And then for women pastors, there's this, okay, so then your husband is also a pastor, which somehow blurs the line of the issue that people have. Like, oh, well, if their husband's there, then that's the man that's got the leadership. I don't know. And my husband is not a pastor. He's a great man, Christian, loves Jesus. He doesn't feel called to ministry. He does a lot of great stuff at our church because he's done that at churches before we were married. He's a great leader, but he's not somebody who is also fulfilling a pastoral role. I in my friendships right now with female pastors around the country, of which I have many, which I'm so fortunate for, I'm not friends with any woman who leads a church of 350 or 400 people that isn't married to a co-pastor. I literally don't know. I know people who lead churches that are 100 people, 150, small local churches, oftentimes mainline churches like, United Methodist, Lutheran. And I'm not saying they're not out there. I'm just saying, even in my network alone, my actual friends, like it just isn't a thing. And it's starting to change. I know of some people, I don't know them personally, but I know of some, but that's how weird it still is in this world. And in my church, like you were describing, it's not strange to them, partly because I started the church and I had a co-pastor at the time who wasn't my husband, and he's still, founding pastor along with me, but isn't in a leadership role anymore. But, I've always been there. So there wasn't like a shift that happened within my local church. And you're right that a lot of my community are people who maybe haven't been churchgoers in the past, but you know what, like a bigger group is, I think it's the people who have been churchgoers who left the church and then are coming back with kind of like a last ditch effort of they know why they left and they're coming back to say, okay, there's something going on here in this community. And I don't think it's just because of me, of course, but the mission and the purpose that we have, the way we engage justice as a community, yet still, care about Jesus and the Bible and things that we think really matter. But the way in which we say there's an opportunity to embrace people and we don't have to agree on all these things to be people who are living a mission of love together is really different. And so they're willing to give it a last chance, honestly. So I feel a lot of pressure to give people a good last ditch effort, because if this is their last stop before they're out the door, of course, I think there's so much value of not being out the door and having a Christian community that's healthy. So I don't want that. So I feel a pressure for that of like, let's make sure this is as healthy and clear and loving and direct as we can be, so that if folks are giving us this final chance at having had left and come back, that we can be a place that helps them heal from some of the, frankly, like spiritual abuse people have experienced in churches.
Right. Because having someone's, salvation on you, like that's no pressure.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And I'm kidding.
It's not on me. It's on
right.
Jesus.
Yeah. So, what I think is you bring up something that is sort of a broad problem, which is like the shoulds, right? So, I think when people, a pastor should do this. I should not run into my pastor at a liquor store. I should not run into my pastor at a tattoo parlor. There are all these should things that I think, to your point about your community being the last ditch effort, is that they've done the should part and they don't really want that. And their lives, all the should things, good people do this. Well, that isn't how life works. Good people make mistakes. Bad people make mistakes. All people make mistakes.
Right.
And they're looking for love and healing and justice. And the conversations that you're having are so much bigger than, well, are you going to go to heaven or not? That conversation is
it's not like it's not an issue. It's just not the only one.
And not the first.
Unless we're reading different Bibles. I don't know. But clearly things like justice are mentioned just as distinct, more than, kind of getting out of, making sure you go to heaven, and important questions, I guess. Absolutely. Like we will absolutely talk about that. But what about the time between now and then?
Hopefully there's a while. Hopefully I got some time to wrestle through that. So when you are thinking about the conversations that are happening from the pulpit and in politics and in the world, is it really hard to navigate that? Because people look to you as someone who, back to the should know the right way to vote, should know the right way to do things. That's got to be hard to talk about.
Yes, it's extremely difficult. Next question. No, it's just
I'm not going to ask you who I should vote for.
Man, it's so challenging. And anybody who's in a role like mine, even thinking about nonprofits and things and like the virtue signaling, and I'm sure you've thought about this, leading an organization, like what are we supposed to be saying and all that. And what I think is so sad about all of it is that it keeps us from actually engaging the situations. In my heart, I'm very passionate about racial justice. It's a top passion for me in my life. And I get concerned that even myself, because I have to be able to talk about it well, that I put more effort into how to talk about it well than actually pursuing it in my life. And the temptation to do that for anybody who's in a public space, whether it's online or in person, is just so strong. And the cancel culture and all those things. And, I think that's happening on all sides, everything. And I think for me, as a person who's a Jesus follower, I don't see myself as being confined to the political groups that we have in our country or other places. And I don't see that most of the labels don't fit for me as a person and a lot of other people in my community. I don't think those labels would fit for Jesus very well. He was trying to get pegged all the time. And frankly, that got him killed. So, that's the reality of the situation, is that being someone who's willing to say, it's actually not about some of these boxes that humans want to put each other in, but pursuing something that you care about. And that means sometimes I'm going to agree with this political party and sometimes I'm going to disagree. Sometimes I'm going to agree with this group of people and what they're choosing, and sometimes I'm not. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to say I can still participate. I think that's super important and critical, and to care about these important conversations. So for me, the best way I can say that I handle it is by giving people a process more than giving people a statement, if that makes sense. So I'm a faith leader. I lead people in how they pursue their faith, which doesn't mean that I tell them how to vote. I tell them, hey, Your faith should inform your politics instead of your politics informing your faith. That switching those two things opens up a huge conversation. Okay. And so talking about that and giving people a process to think through things, I think is more of my role. Or for instance, when terrible things happen, like when George Floyd was murdered, down the street from my church a few miles away, I said to people, hey, we have a process in Christianity, and that looks like lamenting and repenting from the way that we're a part of the brokenness in the world. And then it looks like taking action. We see that in the biblical prophets. We see that throughout the story of Jesus. We see that in the early church. So I'm not going to say a perfectly minced sentence about what I think happened on that corner, but I'm going to be direct about why I think these types of things happen. And then I'm going to say what I think we should do about it, and that people need to figure out in their own spaces how to talk about it, instead of pouring hours into 2 paragraphs that would be perfectly placed. So I'm very careful with what I say and how to say it well, not because I don't want people to get upset, but because I want people to stay engaged. And when people feel shut down by the way we talk about something, they don't stay engaged. So some people, because of my church and myself and many of us so clearly are aligned for racial justice and how to figure out how to do that in a Christian way, there have been some people who felt like they couldn't stay present in the room. But for me, it's about how can we stay present with the people who are willing to hold the tension around the disagreement. And it's probably okay if some people can't hold that tension and they have to find another spot. There's other places they can go when it comes to church if they want to hear what they want to hear. So that's just fine. But we've got folks on both the liberal and the conservative side that feel like, oh, we're really getting pushed here to hold tension. And that to me is a good sign.
Well, and it changes the conversation, because if you can get people on who disagree with each other politically, talking to each other about a deeper issue or the deeper hurt or the why, then you're having conversation, and then the action can happen.
Yep.
So, I applaud what you're doing, and I love watching you do what you do. And we sit on a board together, which is how we met and have become friends. And you don't just lead from a building. You have a podcast that's successful. You've written some books. You have an agent. You have all these things that aren't necessarily associated with the traditional stuffy pastor, which we've already established that's.
And the tattoo. And I have a tattoo artist.
And you have a tattoo artist, right? So you've got all these. Why? So if we think about the podcast and your book writing and some of the work you're doing there, the speaking that you do, what do you feel at the core of it that you're called to say? What do people need to hear, and what are you called to say? What's your message?
That's really good. I love being in the leadership space and talking about leadership and equipping and empowering people. That's a huge passion of mine. And I actually get to do that in spaces that aren't explicitly Christian. And I enjoy doing that. And I'm really careful about the boundaries when I do that. And when I do speaking or coaching in any space that's not explicitly Christian or faith-based. But most of what I do is explicitly in Christian or faith-based spaces. So my core message would be aligned with that. I think that the Jesus way of being in the world, the way that Jesus modeled in the words that Jesus spoke, the ways that he existed in the world, and the works that he did, which were these powerful supernatural things. I think there's an invitation for people who want to follow this Jesus to live in that same way. And that way is super counter narrative to the narratives around us. It doesn't look like the narratives put out there by either of our political parties. It doesn't look like the narratives that are out there around what success means in our world today. It doesn't look like the narratives of really any space that I see around me. It looks like the narrative of being willing to love your enemies, to be patient with people that are hard for you, to be willing to sit and have long suffering conversations with someone who you are seeing like probably fear at its root that comes out in anger towards people that are different than them. It means like being willing to be so generous that you might not get everything that you want. It means that you're gonna like sit with people when they're hurting and be there for them and be present to them. It means like your life doesn't just revolve around you and your kids and your family, but that there's an others orientation to how you move through the world. I mean, the list could go on, but this Jesus way of living has to be intentionally pursued because it's not a natural narrative in our world. And I think that way of being not only is what I think we're called to and what God's hope is for everybody, whether you have decided to follow Jesus or not, or be a person of faith or not, that what I just described is like a good person that's flourishing in the world. It's just not very common. And I think that it's a wonderful, amazing way to live. And it's super freeing and super energizing, and like wondering what God might be doing in the world and joining into that results in things you never would have planned on your own. And the fact that I don't just think that Jesus was like a person, a being that lived and is gone, but that God is with us now and actually is doing things in the world, and the good that comes in the world is part of God's power and action, and human beings get to be a part of that. I think that's the most amazing thing, and that we get to do that. It doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it's comfortable, but I can't imagine living any other way. And when I invite other people into that way of living or considering that way of living, I think it opens up something that is so much more than which side of what political line do we have to be on, and are we supposed to be boycotting somebody right now, and what, like the stuff that turns into what the narratives of faith are supposed to be about. And it just doesn't make sense. Like leading into spaces with love is so powerful. My tattoo artist is an atheist. She is open about that with me, but she asked me a ton of questions. We have some awesome conversations, and I am so willing to hear her and love her. And I have no agenda with her. I don't, just to be honest about who I am and what I'm about. And she told me a couple of weeks ago, she's like, "You are shaking my atheism." And I don't think she means like because you're a really good person. I think she means that the stories that I tell her don't make sense without a higher power. Like they just don't. Like the kinds of things that have happened in my life in the midst of my church, and the kinds of encounters that I have with people because I would say I'm following God's spirit. She just has never heard of it before. And she said, I'm not even sure I'm even open to being a part of any sort of faith system. She's like, but I might want to be a part of your church because like, it seems like with a lot more people doing some of this good stuff, it would go better and faster. Like, I thought that was the most interesting like way of thinking about it. This like Korean atheist woman who like grew up in Seventh-day Adventist and like left it as soon as she could, just completely different conversation. And to me, I just think that's because this is a way of being that is God's hope for us in the world, and that it's attractive if it's actually done and lived into that way, and isn't about judgment, but about freedom and living into some of these amazing things. So that's it. That's the long version and the short version.
and the reason that I know that you're living the Jesus way isn't because your business card, if you have one, says pastor, or because of your Instagram and the things that you believe, but even when I introduce you, these things don't make sense. Like there's this other, like you meet you and you hear everything and it's like, wait, what? And that's exactly what you were talking about, is that it's these things that don't make sense. And that's who Jesus was and how he lived in. And if, to your atheist tattoo artist's point, man, if churches could get together and help and do some things and not just talk about some things, and not come first with like, I'm saving all of you. We're all, and just like, I want to love you and help you. And that's it. That's my whole agenda here is help and love and heal.
Yeah.
The world would be a better place.
Yeah, that's a good point. I do have an agenda, and that's that people feel loved and seen and heard. And that if they want to have a choice about what they do with their life, that would be clear. I'm happy to share that. Just like so many other people are happy to share like their truth and what they believe. And I think that Christians shouldn't necessarily be any different, especially since I think it's an amazing thing to live with love as your motivation. And that's just, it's hard for me to imagine. So can I tell a story of like what happens when people actually follow God into something they didn't expect?
Please.
So when we started our church, it was in 2008, and we're just a group of, 50 people or something. I was 25, and then the guy that was leading with me was 30, and he was married. I was single. He has a first baby on the way. We were too young to know how hard this was going to be. So that's a good sign. It was better that we didn't know how crazy it was to try to start a new church at that time in the city, in a very post-Christian part of the city, which is just a term for, places that most of the people don't go to church anymore and don't participate in organized religion. And so fortunately, we were too young to know any better. But there were some things that we had learned that were really important. Like when you come into a community, and you need to be, first of all, listeners and wait and see kind of community development principles, like be invited into things and not insert yourself with a savior mentality and some of these types of things. And I'm so grateful we had that foundation. And so we started worshiping in a public school, and we still do. Not during COVID, but we'll be going back there next month. And the school's been fantastic, beautiful Art Deco auditorium, comfy seats. So it's actually just great in every way. But the relationship we built with the school from the beginning was just amazing. They were willing to host us. I mean, it was reciprocal. We needed a place to be, but they're also a church or a school that had some pretty high needs as far as kids that were highly mobile or homeless. Probably 80% to 90% were on free or reduced lunch every year. And so we just said to them, hey, look, I know we're just 60, 70 people, but we want to serve. We want to be here to love you. And when you're ready, you can ask us how we can participate. And so they looked at us a little bit like, we're not really sure what you can do. There's 400 students here and it's a big problem and we're struggling, and thanks for the offer, and we said, we're praying for you. And they said, great. But they started to kind of put the ideas out. What about this? Could you help with this? Could you help with this? And they were just like easy things to do. Like, of course we can get you a new paper cutter. Are you kidding? Of course we can get supplies. It just felt like the things that they hadn't felt that they had other resources outside of the district to help them with. It was a Minneapolis public school. And they were all easy. One of them was a little tricky, and it was because they asked us kind of, so we need to get a washing machine hooked up in the basement because we have kids coming that are homeless or highly mobile and they need their clothes washed during the day. And we cannot afford the union person who needs to hook that up. So that's tough. So of course, one of our members was a plumber, and he went down in the basement during the worship service and hooked it up. I don't know, it's probably illegal, but now I'm saying it out here. But that just because the kids need their clothes washed. Are you kidding? And so there was these little kind of tests, like, what are you guys going to do? And so we did all those things. And then finally, about a year and a half, maybe 2 years in, the vice principal said, okay, we've got a problem, and it's a pretty big one. So just know it's okay if there's nothing you can do. But we've got kids that are just clearly dealing with huge levels of food insecurity over the weekend. We serve breakfast, we serve lunch, free or reduced, of course, but they're coming back on Monday just ravenous and can't even get focused until like they're about to leave Monday. So they're like missing Monday educationally. Kids are stealing food out of the lunch line on Fridays. They're taking food out of the trash because they just want to know they have enough, and they don't know if they will. And it's a huge problem. And we said, well, okay, wow, how many kids are we talking about? And they're like, hundreds of kids you can tell they're facing food insecurity in some way. And so we're about 120 people now, and we're going, okay, what do we do? Very long story short, we found some groups that were doing this in other states, and there's more now in the Twin Cities, but they kind of call them backpack programs, where you make sure there's some really healthy food in the kids' backpacks on Fridays. So that takes away the anxiety and fear, and also gives them what they might need for the weekend for them and their family. And so we started doing that with a classroom. By the end of that year, any kid that wanted to, they didn't have to be on free or reduced lunch because it wasn't a government program, it was just our church. Any kid that wanted the meal could have it in their bag on Friday. And it was 300 kids by the end of that year. Well, this is not a part of the strategic plan. This wasn't like, hey, if we could just do this. That's the strategic planning that you do when you're a leader coming in. But as a person who's like, well, God, like, you're writing the story, we're going to follow however you lead, and we're going to do everything we can. And then try things that you don't actually have the resources for, but then the resources come in. We partnered with some other churches that started to do this in their area. And my younger brother, actually, like I said earlier, was a member of my church, and he's in the logistics business. And so he was like, this is actually pretty easy logistics. And people like me looked at him like, no, this is hard. We just want to have a relationship with the school and support these kids. The logistics is hard. And he said, if that's what's so hard, why don't we outsource this and start a nonprofit that can actually do all this logistics, so that churches and community groups and synagogues and everywhere could do this for their local school. And this problem, turns out, is present in every single school that they've ever asked in the entire state of Minnesota so far, including very wealthy places like Wayzata or Edina or Maple Grove, places like where many of us grew up, that you would assume there's problems, but this is not one of them. Every single school has said yes to some extent. And my brother, really was the one who said, let's do it. He launched this nonprofit. And we as a church, like you said earlier, said, hey, other churches, hey, if one of us does this, great. But we're just this one small church. Let's all get involved. And because he was taking all the logistics out of it, this organization was birthed now 10 years ago. It's called Every Meal. And over 280 churches and synagogues and community groups sponsor schools in the Twin Cities now. And Every Meal was the number one responder during COVID, during the uprising after George Floyd was murdered, to bringing food to kids. And at this point, they've served 6 million meals in 10 years. It's nuts. Like, this wasn't in my brother's like 5-year plan. Like, this wasn't in my, like, here's how a church can be effective in the world today. Like, it just wasn't. It would have been too small. Like, our vision would have been too small. And there's so many times when I want something to work out and it doesn't. And other times when I realize if I just follow this story that God is writing, something amazing is going to happen. It's going to be hard. It might cost a lot of money, but it's going to do something that we never could have done by ourselves, without other people, without the church. Sometimes I use the term big C, lots of churches with very different belief systems. And I would say that at the core of that is like the Spirit of Jesus inviting people into that. Whether they think that or not, that's where my perspective, and I just can't think of any other way to live. That's just an amazing thing. Like, that story is not one that I could have written if I was trying to write like a novel or something, you know?
But you have written books and you have done these other things, and your narrative continues to grow and to expand. And it's about helping people at the end of the day. And so many people have really negative stereotypes, forget the pastor part, about churches and about religion and about organized religion. And it's because they don't see the helping part of it, because for some reason that got taken out of it. And instead of getting our hands dirty and helping people and looking for problems and helping the problems, we just decided to talk about problems and debate about problems. And that isn't doing anything for anyone.
No, it's really not. And I feel like, there's no feeding these kids. There's no expectation of needing to be exposed to anything religious, if that makes sense. But there's people who have become Christians and decided to follow Jesus because of Every Meal, because the story was so compelling that they thought, wait a second, helping them without any expectation of response, helping them because God says that, Jesus himself said that little children are so important and none of them should be hungry. What are you doing? And you're not expecting to do that in order to get them into some spot. No, because the story itself is what compels the right people to join into that. And you don't need to say, I'll give you this food or I'll support you in this way if we can also, force you into a space religiously. I just don't think that that's necessary. And I think that it still does result in people being intrigued by the story of God. And that's how God invites people into the story, rather than being forced into it in order to receive a handout or something like that.
Well, it's such a cool program, and hopefully more states do it, because to your point, I think it's really easy, especially in neighborhoods where people think everything's good here. We don't have any problems here. They don't want to see the problems. If you ask the right questions, everybody needs help. Everyone has something that they want to, that we could do better and help each other on. So we talked about it. There's a couple of other things in your narrative that we need to talk about. Okay, so describe the tattoos. We've talked about the tattoos. These people that have been listening to all this, like, just tell me about the tattoos. Now's the time.
Yeah, so my tattoo artist's name is Heather Kim, and you can find her on Instagram, so then you can see her style. But she's, like I said earlier, she's Korean. And so there's a style from Korean tattooing called fine line. And so they're very fine lines, small lines. But as Kristi knows, like, I have a lot of those fine lines, creating this beautiful, on one arm, like a floral pattern, and then on the other kind of like a symbolic pattern. And this kind of art developed in Korea because I think to this day, even in South Korea, it's illegal to tattoo people. Like, there's not any, like, they're not doing any sort of regulation like we do in the US. So the fine line was in a way to kind of make the instruments are very small and stuff. She's told me all about this. Anyway, it's pretty cool. And people are trying to emulate it, American, tattoo artists. But if you don't really know the style and aren't taught well, it actually could turn into not so great tattoos, to be honest. So that's why it's important for me to say that. Like, make sure they know how to do it. And as a Korean woman, she said a lot of the videos and the tutorials in this type of tattooing have been in Korean up until recently. So that's why a lot of like American tattoo artists aren't able to do it yet, but they're learning. And so if you look up fine line tattoos, but my favorite is the half sleeve that I have that's floral. And it's based off of the book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. And there's a scene where Aslan, who's this lion, he's the God figure, the Jesus figure in the story. It's a symbolic story. He they're looking for him, like we might say, well, I'm looking for God, or I'm looking for a higher power. And so they're looking for this lion because he hasn't been there for a long time. And in this land that they're in, it's frozen over. They say it's always winter and never Christmas, which is like the long Minnesota winter, we all understand. And then they find out that, or in a moment, it's described in this book, and the movies and stuff, that it turns from winter to spring in like 5 minutes. And all of the animals and all of the humans know that means that Aslan must be coming. Like they say, Aslan's on the move. So that means this lion is moving and winter is turning into spring. And for me, the symbolism of that story, how winter can seem really long, and the things that we go through in life can feel never ending, and suffering can feel like it's always, insurmountable, especially when we look back at these last, 18 months or so. But spring always comes, and it's not always when you want it to, it's not always as quickly as you want it to, but spring always comes. And so I have got snowflakes turning into plants up to the sun on my shoulder. And if you look very, very close, you can see a little lion in there amongst the plants. But it's all the plants, these beautiful plants that C.S. Lewis describes in the book. So I asked my atheist tattoo artist if she could put all those plants on my arm, and she did. It took almost 2 years of sessions, but she did.
Did she read the book?
She did not, I don't think. But I described it to her and explained to her what it was about. And she thought it was awesome. And I think it was her idea to hide Aslan's face in there as an Easter egg. So that was pretty fun.
It's such a cool tattoo. And I love C.S. Lewis. I love all those books. So I did find Aslan. We were having lunch and
yes. I made sure you could look for him. The other tattoo on my other sleeve is, the most prominent thing is the Minneapolis bridges. And I have a real heart for our city and for what's going on. But I think that for me, a big part of that is like what it means to be a bridge builder. And it's difficult to do that because you get walked on sometimes if you're a bridge between things. But I think the bridges are beautiful. But I also think that for me, that's at the core, like what I want to be about in my life. And so she designed that based off of the Minneapolis bridges.
They're very cool, both of them, and meaningful, which I love when you see someone's tattoos and say, tell me about this.
Yeah.
And they have this really cool story, which
you got to be a storyteller. If you're going to get tattoos like this, you got to be a storyteller, because otherwise people are like, what do you mean you don't want to talk about? People are going to ask you, so you got to be ready.
They're really neat. Okay, so the other thing, unicorns. You love unicorns. I love unicorns. Tell me why you love
unicorns.
Right? What before everyone loved unicorns. Let's just
Yes.
Way before, and now everyone has a unicorn. But we were into them before. But tell me why you like unicorns.
What was that? What's that video game that kids your age are playing? I think that's what made the unicorns popular. With all the
kids my age, like old people. What old people are playing?
No. Kids like your kids.
Oh, kids like my kids.
Yeah, like the high schoolers. What's that?
Fortnite?
Fortnite. I think Fortnite made the unicorn like mainstream. But I
thought it was us.
Well, yeah, I think we were trying to be like, hey, we're doing our thing. You guys can get on board if you want. But then Fortnite turned it into like something you can buy at Target. Like
everywhere.
But I like the unicorn. And you can share your unicorn story. But my unicorn story is everything we just talked about puts me in a spot where when people talk to me, they look at me like they're looking at a unicorn. And so like, wait, this doesn't seem like it totally fits. And so I feel like connected to the unicorn because it's like, we understand each other. We're kind of, not what everyone's expecting. And then in my church, we talk about it a lot too, because my church is kind of a unicorn too. Just doesn't really, it's like, wait, what are we talking about? We're not picking political parties. We have a female pastor. We have an African pastor and an African-American pastor and an Indian pastor also. Wait, what's happening? This is just a unicorn thing. So we have a unicorn mascot on my team. His name's PU, the purple unicorn. And he is awarded to people when they are doing something, awesome that week. And so that's where the unicorn. So I've been given little unicorns by people because they knew I liked unicorns. And then I came to your office and it looks like the same thing happened to you.
Absolutely. Yes. I started saying years ago, if a business like this could happen to someone like me, unicorns must be real. And it took off. And there are I get gifts of unicorns. Someday I'm going to get a tattoo, I think. And I think a unicorn might be part of it. But I sort of have to let the popular
go together and get unicorn tattoos.
Okay, I think we need to think about this, but I think I potentially am in on this.
Let's do it. It. We'll get Heather to design it. It'll be awesome.
Okay, this is a big podcast right now. Yes,
okay. You heard it here, people.
I'll do this. So I love the other thing that I really appreciate about you is that you have promoted your tattoo artist. You promoted you promoted your brother's, nonprofit. You haven't mentioned the name of your church, the name of your books, or the name of your podcast.
Whoops.
So, because that's who you are. But I feel like we need, before the last question, you need to do all the things, and we'll put all the links on the website. But if I'm your agent, I want you to name some things.
My agent's upset. No, I literally didn't realize that I didn't do that. So my church is called Mill City Church. It's named after the city. Mill City is a nickname for Minneapolis because of all the flour mills and some of the sawmills that started the city. And when we started the church, we thought, hey, what do you do when you love something? Like, you name your kid after it. So we were like, well, we're here to love the city. This is what we're about. We're loving our community in the name of Jesus. So let's name it Mill City after the city. So Mill City Church is online, millcitychurch.com. My podcast is with my friend Jo Saxton, who is a speaker and author and leadership coach, Nigerian British woman who has
amazing
accent. So listen to it just because Jo would be interesting, reading the phone book.
It's like the best Mary Poppins.
She's just excellent. Yep. And then she's brilliant. So it doesn't matter that she's not just reading the phone book. She's saying brilliant things. And she says brilliant all the time too, because she's British. But Jo and I have been doing leadership stuff together for a long time. And so our podcast, Lead Stories, is just talking about leadership and life and what it looks like to we sometimes say, get your leadership together. Like, we need to confront some of the stuff going on in our life, imposter syndrome, all that stuff. And it's for both men and women. We've got a lot of women that listen to us because it's 2 women, but we love our Lead Stories guys. And it's not just for leaders in faith-based spaces. And so, we definitely talk from a faith perspective, but our listeners are leading in spaces like you and so many others in public, nonprofit, for-profit spaces, leading in their families and their neighborhoods too. We define leadership as being intentional with your influence. And everyone has a chance to be intentional with their influence, even if they're little 3-year-old Steph or teenagers and all of that. And then that's anywhere podcasts can be found. And then I do have 2 books. The first book I wrote a couple years ago, it's called Stay Curious: How Questions and Doubts Can Save Your Faith. And it's just kind of about how it's actually really healthy and good to ask questions about faith systems you might have been handed down, and actually can lead to a really much more robust experience. That's been my experience and a lot of other people. And then my most recent book is called Make a Move: How to Stop Wavering and Make Decisions in a Disorienting World. And I picked that title in 2019. And then I wrote the book during the pandemic, and I didn't know why disorienting world was so important, but now I do. And so it's a book about how to make decisions in that way that I was just speaking about, like along the Jesus way, and being less obsessed with finding some sort of perfect will that God or some sort of higher power is trying to enforce on you, like you're a Lego character, and instead embracing a way of being in the world that informs our decisions. And also some really practical decision-making advice that I've learned over the years. And it's going great. People are giving me some great feedback on it. So I'm super grateful for it.
It's fantastic. I love what you're doing. I love your message. I look forward to our next lunch and our potential tattoo date.
And our tattoo date. It's going to be great. It's going to be awesome. I love it. And you and so many other women like you are the reason that people like me who are in a male dominated field, feel like we're not alone, because you have to look outside your field for that, so I think that explains why Kristi and I just got to know each other in the last year, but are already getting tattoos together, because you got to encourage it. So anybody listening who's kind of like, oh man, I just don't see this around me, you might have to look at the next space over, but you're not alone. And there's always going to be people that can encourage you along the way. So thank you for being one of those people for me, Kristi.
Yeah, thank you. Back at you. Final thing of the podcast. Scripture, maybe you're a pastor, maybe not. You're not. I don't know. I'm interested to hear what quote or something that has helped motivate you to flip your script.
Yeah, that's good. There's many scriptures, but I think that one of the quotes that motivated me the most in my kind of early stages of starting the church and what we were thinking about and why I started a new church. And it's a quote by a man named E.D. Nixon, who was a civil rights activist, part of the organizer for the Montgomery bus boycott and all that. And his little snippet quote is, "Your spark can become a flame and change everything." And thinking about, I love fire, first of all, but also thinking about how it just takes a spark to be able to have something as powerful as a flame that becomes, something that can spread and in a positive way. And that's what a bunch of people joining in on something that makes sense and is about how we can help humans flourish can literally change everything.
What a fantastic way to end it. Our conversation. I enjoyed it. I don't know if anyone listening enjoyed it, but
I did. Maybe it's just for us.
Maybe if it was a great use of an hour for me.
Yeah,
I really appreciate your perspective. I love it when people don't fit molds and are not ashamed or quiet about that, because other people need to see that, because nobody fits into a mold. Those people are boring. We don't want those people around.
You don't want that.
So my one takeaway, I have so many takeaways from the conversation, Stephanie, but I think if the next time someone listening has someone say to them, no, I'm not sure you can do that, and they channel you and think, well, Nana, I'm going to do it anyway.
There it is.
My hope is that Stephanie's story empowers you to believe you're capable of more than you think, to discover motivation, to uncover inspiration, and to find the strength to turn the page.
Thank you for listening to Flip Your Script, hosted by Kristi Piehl and produced by Media Minefield. If you like our message, please be sure to give us a 5-star rating, subscribe to the show, and share our episodes with your family and friends. Do you or someone you know have a story about flipping your script? We'd love to share it. Contact us on our website, flipyourscriptpodcast.com. To stay up to date on all things Flip Your Script, make sure to follow host Kristi Piehl on social media. You can also check out the website for pictures, resources mentioned in the show, and other great episodes.